A homemade hot air balloon lies crashed in a forest. 2 families, 4 of them children. They built it to escape East Germany, and they missed. Only 180 meters, less than 200 yards, on the far side of those trees, West Germany. Freedom, lights they could see. But the balloon had come down on the wrong side, still inside the East, still trapped. And the ground between them and those lights was not ordinary ground. It was mined. It was wired. It was watched from towers by men with orders to shoot. To cross it on foot was to die. So the 8 people climbed down out of the basket. They left the balloon where it had fallen, and they ran. Back into the country they had just risked everything to escape. They left all of it behind them in that clearing. The envelope, the basket, the burner, every piece of it cut, welded, and stitched by their own hands. Evidence lying in the open with their fingerprints all over it. Somewhere behind them in the dark was the most thorough secret police force in the world. And now that secret police force had their balloon. To build that balloon, 2 families had spent 18 months committing a crime. Not a loud crime, not a dramatic one. In East Germany, the crime was simply this: planning to leave. The state treated the intention to escape as seriously as the act itself. Just preparing to go, buying the wrong things, asking the wrong questions, was enough to lose everything. The 2 men at the center of it were not the sort the secret police usually watched. Peter Strelzik was an electrician at a plastics factory in Pößneck, a small industrial town in Thuringia. Günther Wetzel, 13 years younger, was a bricklayer at the same factory. They had become friends over shifts and break rooms. Ordinary colleagues, ordinary jobs, in a town that rarely appeared on any map. Neither was a dissident, neither had a political cause. What they had was a quieter and far more dangerous thing. They had decided to leave, and they were not going to wait for permission that was never going to come. The reason the plan involved a balloon at all was simple. Every other way out was a way to die. The border between East and West Germany was not a line on a map. It was a fortified zone, fences, tripwires, dogs, watchtowers, and a wide strip of mined ground walked by guards under standing orders to shoot anyone who reached it. To cross on foot was suicide. To hide in a vehicle was to gamble against searches that almost always won. Strelzik had spent years as a mechanic in the East German Air Force, and he thought the way a mechanic thinks. If you could not go through a thing, and you could not go around it, then you went over it. In March of 1978, the idea arrived. A magazine article about hot air balloon festivals in the West. Strelzik read it and could not put it down. He took it to Wetzel, and in a single conversation, the 2 families bound themselves to a plan that, if it failed, would put the parents in prison and hand their children to the state. And that was the part with no good answer. Strelzik and Wetzel had 4 children between them, the youngest 2 years old, the oldest 15. They decided, early, to tell them nothing at all. A child who knows a secret is a child who might repeat it, to a teacher, to a friend, in one careless sentence in a schoolyard. So the children would be kept in the dark to keep them safe. And every day, for 18 months, the parents would carry the full weight of it alone. The work began in the attic of the Strelzik house, and from the first day, the attic was a problem. It could not look like what it was. No workbench, no tools laid out, nothing a visitor might glance at and recall later. Fabric went under bed sheets whenever anyone came to the door. The whole project lived in one room that no outsider could ever be allowed to see. And in a country where neighbors were encouraged to report neighbors, even a locked attic door was a small risk, carried every single day. Strelzik knew nothing about flight, and that too was a danger. Because the obvious way to learn was to ask, and asking was impossible. A question about how much weight a balloon could lift was a question that could be remembered, repeated, and traced. So he taught himself. He read what he could find in the public library and worked the physics by hand. The numbers were daunting. To lift 8 people, the balloon would need an enormous volume of hot air. And that meant an enormous quantity of fabric. And buying fabric was the most exposed part of the entire plan. A balloon that size needed an enormous amount of cloth, enough to cover a tennis court several times over. Anyone who walked into a small town shop and bought that much at once would be noticed. And in East Germany, being noticed was how investigations began. So they broke the purchase into pieces. A few meters in one town, a different bolt in another. Long drives to distant shops where their faces were not known. Once, buying a large quantity of taffeta, they told the shopkeeper it was for a sailing club, that they needed it to stitch sails. Every purchase was a small performance. Every shop assistant was a person who might, weeks later, mention the strange customers to exactly the wrong listener. Then the cloth had to become a balloon, and that work fell mostly to the women. Doris Strelzik and Petra Wetzel sewed the panels together at night after the children were asleep. And at night, a sewing machine has a sound, a steady mechanical rhythm, hour after hour, carrying through the wall of a quiet house on a quiet street. They worked knowing that any neighbor lying awake might wonder why. That machine ran until 3 a.m, week after week, month after month. Their first balloon never even flew. The fabric was too porous. The hot air passed straight through it, and the envelope would not hold its shape. Months of secret work, of risk taken night after night, and it could not lift its own weight off the ground. They scrapped it, and then, knowing exactly how exposed they already were, they began again. The second balloon used taffeta, a tighter weave, but a balloon is only half a machine. The other half was the burner, and the burner nearly ended the plan before it began. Strelzik's early burners produced flame, but never enough heat to lift 8 people. He tried more cylinders. He tried different fuel mixtures. For a long time, the problem simply would not break. Then, in June of 1979, it did. He found that turning the propane cylinders upside down forced the liquid gas to vaporize faster, and the flame leapt out longer and hotter than before. By some accounts, as long as 12 meters, roughly 40 feet. There is something I keep coming back to in that detail. The breakthrough that made the whole escape possible was not handed to them by an expert. It was found by an electrician, alone, turning a gas bottle over in his hands, because asking for help was a risk he could not take. By the summer of 1979, the second balloon and its working burner were ready. 18 months of risk, folded into a single craft. They picked a night, they waited for the wind, and they drove out toward the border, toward the one part of the plan that no amount of caution in an attic could ever make safe. And so, on the night of the 3rd of July, 1979, they came back to that clearing near the border. They unloaded the second balloon and inflated it in the dark. And it worked. The burner fired, the taffeta filled, and the balloon rose into the night with all 8 of them in the basket. For a few minutes, it did exactly what Strelzik's calculations had promised. Then it climbed into a cloud. And a cloud, it turned out, was something the library books had not warned him about. Moisture settled across the fabric. The envelope grew heavier. The balloon began slowly to sink. And it came down among the trees, 180 meters from the border. They ran, and weeks later, the Stasi found what they had left behind. What the secret police were looking at was a crime scene with no suspect. So they worked it the way the East German state worked everything. Slowly, patiently, without panic. Fabric samples went to laboratories, to identify the weave and the manufacturer. Medicine bottles found near the basket still carried fragments of their labels. The burner told the investigators something specific. They were not hunting a trained aircraft engineer. They were hunting someone with practical hands, someone who could improvise. On the 14th of August, the Stasi did something unusual. They went public. They issued an appeal, and they listed the recovered items in detail. The fabric, the bottles, the burner. For the two families, that appeal carried two messages at once. The first was relief. The Stasi still did not know who they were. The second was a warning. The Stasi were looking now, and they had a great deal to work with. And inside the two households, something else was breaking. The failure had cost the Wetzels months of sleep, money they could not spare, and a kind of nerve that does not refill easily. Günter Wetzel had a wife. He had children. The version of this story that ended in a prison cell was no longer an abstraction. It was a real place with a real door. And quietly, without ever saying it outright, the Wetzels began to pull back. It was the closest the whole plan ever came to ending. Peter Strelzik argued the other way. And his argument was not comfort. It was logic. Stopping now, he said, did not make them safe. It only made them people who had already done every dangerous thing required to be arrested, without the one thing that made the danger worth it. The evidence in that clearing already pointed toward Thuringia. The investigation was already moving. Standing still would not stop it. Building, at least, gave them a way out before it arrived. Wetzel came back. It took weeks, and the friendship that resumed was not quite the friendship that had existed before. There was a new carefulness in it now. A thin seam ran through the middle of it, the kind of crack that holds, but that everyone can feel. The third balloon was built differently, because they had learned exactly what the second one got wrong. It was larger. The fabric changed, this time a tightly woven nylon, the kind used to make umbrellas, better at holding heat. The burner was the rebuilt one, the one with the long flame. And the work in the attic changed its character. The first balloon had been built slowly, almost patiently. The third was built in something close to fear. Somewhere out there, investigators were asking about fabric, about money, about households that did not quite add up. And the families had no way of knowing how close those questions had come. They knew only that Thuringia was not large, and that every unfinished day was a day the search had room to grow. The children still knew nothing, but by now both families had begun, without ever announcing it, to let go of their old lives. Neighbors were spoken to a little differently, the way you speak when you are quietly closing a conversation, rather than continuing it. Small routines were dropped. Doris Strelzik gave away a few things she had kept for years. By the middle of September, the third balloon was ready. The families began to watch the sky, waiting for a wind out of the northwest, the wind that would carry them toward Bavaria. The night before they left, they finally told the children, not everything, just enough. We are leaving, we are going over. Be ready by dark. The children did not argue. Perhaps they had understood more, and for longer, than their parents had ever believed. If a story like this is the reason you are here, take 1 second to subscribe. It is the single thing that keeps forgotten Europe digging into the corners of this history that almost no one else tells. At around 2:30 in the morning, on the 16th of September, 1979, both families stood in a dark field near Lobenstein, a small town close to the border. They unrolled the balloon across the grass in near silence. The burner fired, low and careful, enough to fill the envelope, never so much that the light would reach the tree line. A balloon that size takes a long time to inflate. For long minutes, it lay half-formed and shapeless. Neither cloth nor aircraft, while 8 people stood around it and listened to the dark. Then it was ready. 2 couples and 4 children climbed into a basket built in an attic out of welded steel tube. The burner opened up and the ground let go. The cold came first. Even in September, the air at altitude was sharp in a way the ground had not prepared anyone for, and there was nothing to shelter behind. Only the basket frame and the open sky on every side. The children pressed close to their parents. Almost no one spoke. There was nothing to say that would have helped. Below them was darkness, and the darkness gave nothing away. They had no instruments, no map, no landmarks. They knew the wind was carrying them northwest, and that was the whole of what they knew. The country underneath them might have been East Germany. It might already have been the West. It might have been the death strip itself. From a basket, in the dark, there was no way to tell the difference. The burner had to be fired every so often, just to hold their height. And every time it lit, the flame was a bright orange mark in the sky, visible to anyone below who happened to look up. Strelzik kept each burn as short as he dared, and let the balloon sink quietly between them, trading height for darkness. A few minutes after they lifted off on the ground, the alarm went out. An unidentified object, somewhere over the border zone. Searchlights swung up into the night and swept the underside of the sky. But the balloon was too high and too dark, and the beams found nothing. By the time anyone could fix a position, it had already drifted out of the sector. And then the balloon began to come down. And this time, it did not level off. The burner fired. It held the height for a moment. Then the descent began again, and it was faster. The propane was nearly gone. There was no longer a decision to make about where to land. The balloon would land where it landed. The only question left was the one that had shadowed the entire flight. Which side? The basket hit the ground hard, a flat, jarring impact that threw everyone against the frame, dragged a few meters through a field, and stopped. In the crash, Günter Wetzel broke his leg. 8 people sat in a dark field, in a place they could not name, listening for a voice, an engine, a dog, anything that would tell them whether they had made it. There was nothing, no streetlights, no sound, so they climbed out of the basket and moved carefully toward the edges of the field. Wetzel, broken leg and all, was the first to reach a road. And the first thing he noticed was the asphalt. It was smooth, maintained. The roads pressed up against the eastern side of the border tended to be rough, half neglected. This one was not, but a road was not proof, so he followed it until he found a sign. The sign said, Nyla. Nyla is a town in Bavaria, in West Germany. The accounts the families later gave of that moment are strikingly quiet. There were no cheers, no speeches. What they describe sounds less like triumph and more like a release. The letting go of something they had been holding at full tension for 18 months. 18 months of sewing machines after midnight, of children kept in the dark, of a secret police investigation tightening week by week around the town they had just left, and one number finally undone. The second balloon had fallen 180 meters short. The third had carried them all the way across. West German police reached them soon after. The families were taken in, registered, and within days the story had broken across the Western press. 2 families, a homemade balloon, 28 minutes over one of the most heavily guarded borders on Earth. In the East, the Stasi investigation ran on for a few more weeks before the truth settled in. There was no one left to arrest, and they had been close. The search had already narrowed to a short list of towns, and Poznek was on it. The record suggests the families left with only weeks to spare, possibly less. What followed was quieter and not entirely kind. The 2 families had crossed together But the friendship did not survive what came after. The press, the attention, the strain of it. They drifted apart in the West, and the East German state did not simply forget them. The Stasi kept watching, kept a file open, and a friend of Strelzik's, back home, was imprisoned as a suspected escape helper. Today, the third balloon sits in a museum. You can stand in front of it. And it is a strange thing to look at, because it does not look like an aircraft. It looks like exactly what it is. A vast, hand-stitched object, sewn together in an attic by two ordinary families who decided that 28 minutes in the dark was a better risk than the rest of their lives behind a wall. If you want more of these stories, the ones that history almost kept, subscribe to Forgotten Europe. Most of them have never been told, and we are only getting started.